Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the June edition of the Southeast Climate Monthly webinar, where we talk about climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. I'm Sandra Rain, the Regional Climatologist from the Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I will be given a climate overview today. We also have guest speakers, Jeff Dober from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources overview. Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will give an agricultural impact update, and our special topic speaker, Matthew Rosenkrantz from the Climate Prediction Center, who will give a hurricane outlook. Just a reminder, type all of your questions and comments in the question box at any time, and they will be answered at the end. Also, a recap of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to this recording. All right, let's talk about the climate. So for the past 30 days, much of the Southeast region has seen slightly below average temperatures. This is due in part because of the cool weather much of the region experienced on May 12th and 13th. Some places didn't even get above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, such as Raleigh, North Carolina, and Rome, Georgia. In contrast, however, some parts of Florida saw slightly above temperatures. West Palm Beach even had its warmest May on record. Although we've seen a good amount of precipitation this past week in the eastern Carolinas and parts of Virginia, overall the Southeast is still slightly below normal for precipitation during the past 30 days. Fort Myers, Florida only received 0.04 inches of rain, making this the driest May on record. But hopefully with the recent precipitation occurring now, this shall be eased up. The Southeast saw quite a bit of severe weather. Strong storms moved through the Greensboro, North Carolina area on May 10th, allowing hail to accumulate quickly, and it looked like snow. Also on May 10th, lightning struck parts of Interstate 10 in Walton County, Florida, sending debris into a pickup truck, and 2 people were injured because of that. On May 3rd, an EF1 tornado with winds of 110 miles per hour came through York County, South Carolina, damaging a family farm and unfortunately killing 4,000 turkeys. So these maps are showing the probability of severe weather, pattern across the across the whole nation for the next month. And if you look specifically at the Southeast region, it really doesn't change that much. So we can expect severe weather to continue for the next month. La Niña has ended. On May 13th, the CPC has issued its final La Niña advisory and says there is a 67% chance of neutral conditions will continue through August. Confidence is lower, however, for the autumn and winter, but they will release the new outlook this Thursday, June 10th. So it will be interesting to see how that continues to evolve. As far as the U.S. Drought Monitor, it continues to be very dry in the west and slightly dry in the eastern part of the nation. Closer to home, we see at the beginning of May, we had abnormally dry conditions in the Carolinas and parts of southern Florida. But towards the end of May, severe drought developed in eastern South Carolina and southern North Carolina. However, this might be changing this Thursday. As the outlook continues to show, the drought removal should be likely for the eastern Carolinas. However, it should persist for parts of Puerto Rico. As we get into the 6 to 10 day outlook, the probability of above normal temperatures continues for the Southeast region, as well as the probability for above normal precipitation. So that will really help out with our current dry conditions. As we get into the next 3 months, again, we have the probability of above normal temperatures through August and the probability of above average precipitation as well. However, for the rest of this week, we should expect some rain showers to continue through Friday for parts of the southeast region, especially in North Carolina and Virginia. So just to sum up, the past temperatures were slightly below average for most of the southeast region. Past precipitation was also slightly below average for most of the region. However, the precipitation has picked up in the last week. Severe weather, we saw lightning hit parts of Interstate 10 in Florida, hail in Greensboro, and an EF1 tornado in York County, South Carolina. La Niña has ended. It'll be interesting to see what they say this Thursday, June 10th. Short-term drought in eastern South Carolina and southeastern North Carolina will likely be removed this week. And the next 3 months will likely be warmer and wetter. Now I'm going to throw it over to Jeff with the water resources outlook.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. As Sandra pointed out, May was pretty dry around the southeast, and that reciprocated to stream flows. We go to the next slide here, and we can see that for the most part, all those above normal stream flows that we had in the Carolinas, those are now near normal. And for the most part, we see near normal stream flows across most of the southeast. Here, these are the 28-day average stream flows. On the left, the map, and then to the right there, that's our duration hydrograph for the 28-day average runoff or average stream flows. Looking back the last 2 years, and you can see we've had quite a dip since the winter and early spring period, but we're still in the normal range. And stream flows generally tend to come down this time of year across the southeast as a whole. As we get a little bit less rainfall in April and with evapotranspiration increasing with temperatures and such. So near normal across most of the southeast right now. We'll go to the next slide, and as we break it down by state, we can see in Alabama that same sort of signal where we were above normal in the wintertime, and now we've come down since that period with the dry May, but we're still in the normal range. Again, for Georgia, similar normal range here. And then as we head into Florida, they were more in the normal range during the winter period. So now they're encroaching in on below normal stream flows there as we head into the summer period. Next slide. Now, if we head into the Carolinas, they've been exceptionally dry, as Sandra pointed out here, the last month or so, and we've seen the stream flows come down quite a bit. Big change from February, where we were in the 90th percentile or highest as far as stream flows. Now we're encroaching in on the 10 to 24 percentile range, or the below normal range, as we head into mid-June here. Thankfully, we are getting some rain, which may hopefully keep it in that normal range. But as far as South Carolina, you can see that steep slope there, steep fall over the last couple of months. Same for North Carolina. And then Virginia, they're actually in the below normal range right now as far as stream flows. So again, sort of goes along those same lines as Sandra pointed out with the drought monitor, having some drought develop. Go to the next slide here. And we can see our current conditions right now. We do have a minor flood, an isolated minor flood in parts of western North Carolina, or eastern North Carolina there, and some higher flows in some of the rivers in eastern North Carolina from recent rains. And then we've got some baneful rivers and some of the headwaters in the Florida Panhandle, as well as parts of the Tombigbee and Alabama, lower Alabama River. But for the most part, stream flows are in normal range, and for the most part, staying out of flood for this time of year, which is not unusual. If we go to the next slide here, We can see the river flood climatology. This is our river flood climatology for the Southeast, and we're in week 23. And as I pointed out, it just said usually a quiet time of year for river flooding across the area. The only exception, and I don't show this here, is the Florida Peninsula. As we go into the next several weeks, we'll see the convective rainy season start to pick up a little bit more. And usually in the Tampa area and parts of Central Florida, we'll see river flooding pick up during the midsummer months. But for the most part, flooding typically not typical during this period time of year. And it won't be till more as we head into late summer, early fall, where we get more of the chance of tropical systems that we see pick up in river flood potential. So we go to the next slide. And talking about tropical storms, this is a graph of basically Atlantic Basin storms, Southeast storms, Atlantic Basin storms that affected the Southeast region of the United States, and then those Southeast storms that produced significant rainfall or river flood storms. And we can see last year, again, was a record year. As we look back from 1965 to 2020, we had the 30 named storms with 10 of those affecting the Southeast. So about 1 in 3 affected the Southeast, but we really got spared as far as those storms being significant rainfall or river flood storms. So we actually ended up with, I believe, 1 or 2 there, as the graph shows. So not as bad as some of the season in 2016, 2017, and 2018. So a busy Atlantic season doesn't always mean a busy Southeast season, nor does it mean that we're going to have a busy river flood season in the Southeast. But it does potentially raise our chances a little bit more, and I can show that. We go to the next slide here. And we see historically we get 1 in 4 storms in the Atlantic Basin impact the Southeast. So actually last year was a little bit more active. We had 1 in 3. So 1 in 4 storms impact the Southeast out of the Atlantic Basin. But the next slide, as far as those storms producing widespread river flooding, only about 1 in 9. So I know the hurricane forecast, I believe, is for 13 to 20 named storms. That would put us in potentially, and that's again through the whole hurricane season, that would potentially, logically say that maybe we'll see 1 or 2 potentially widespread or storms that could produce widespread river flooding this season on average. But we'll see. So we'll go to the next slide, and I'm sure there'll be some more discussion on that as later in the webinar here. So as far as the summer stream flow flood outlook, we're more or less talking about typical river flooding across the whole Southeast. Again, stream flows are running near normal most locations. There's, again, we see this overall slight decline trend in May, but an active tropical season that could pose potential for flooding during the summer period. So that's sort of our forecast for flooding, river flooding, June, July, and August. Again, stream flows generally near normal across the region with a general decline after a dry May. Again, 1 in 9 storms typically produce widespread flooding in the Southeast region. So that could potentially expect 1 to 2 tropical storm flooding events in the Southeast through the fall. And overall, the typical number and magnitude of river floods this summer is what is expected. Nothing unusual and nothing to really hang our hat on to say that we're going to have above or below normal river flooding, at least through the midsummer period. And that's all I had as far as the water resources and flood outlook for the summer period, and tying in the tropical season a little bit there. That's all I had, and I will pass it on to Pam.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's the high season for agriculture in Georgia and the Southeast as a whole. I bought my first Georgia peaches today in the grocery store, and they're a little on the small side, but they taste delicious. And so I'm looking forward to a lot more of that as we go along. I'm going to give you a few of the agricultural highlights. I will make one note about what Jeff said about the rain last year. It didn't cause a lot of river flooding, but it sure caused a lot of problems for the farmers because the fields were wet so much of the summer and into the fall as well. So if we go on, this is the last 14 days. Sandra showed the last 30 days, but this is the last 14 days. On the left is the percent of normal rainfall. And you can see how dry it's been in the panhandle of Florida with almost no rain at all in that area, and southern Georgia, even northern Georgia. It was really dry up here in Athens. And we finally got our first rain in like 2 or 3 weeks in the last couple of days. And even then it wasn't too much. I think it's interesting to note that for the last 14 days, eastern North Carolina is still showing pretty wet, even though they've got some pretty bad drought there. And so it's just kind of a disconnect between the longer term hydrology and the shorter term dry conditions, which of course agriculture is really concerned with, making sure that the plants get water every week. So that's something to be considering when you're thinking about drought conditions. The shorter term stuff often is not captured in the drought monitors. On the right-hand side there is the departure from normal temperature. You can see that even though for the last 30 days it's been quite cool, if you look at just the last 2 weeks, it's been quite warm across a lot of the area, not so much in Alabama and in Florida, but certainly the Carolinas and Virginia have had very warm conditions associated with that high pressure. We move on. Some of the impacts that we've seen in agriculture. The wet conditions slowed things down getting into the fields, and now the dry conditions are also, they're helping some producers to get into the fields because it's finally dry enough to drive equipment in without destroying the soil structure. But it's hard to plant things that need to have soil moisture to be germinated, and so some crops have been delayed due to that. And they're finally now getting their last crops of peanuts and cotton into the fields. The places that have irrigation, of course, are using it quite heavily. Dry land crops are not generally looking as well because of the dry conditions that we've had over the last 3 weeks. And one of the things that's really been affected by that a lot, probably more than any other crop, has been the pasture and forage. This time of year, of course, you know, the farmers have used up most of their winter hay, and they're really looking to turn the cattle out into the pastures to eat that nice green grass, and there hasn't been a lot of it. And so they've been trying to feed what hay they have left and are having some problems with that. And you might remember we had frost a couple times in April. They are still assessing some of the damage impacts from that, but overall, I think they haven't been as bad as they expected. Of course, individual farmers certainly have been dinged by that, but overall, I think it's in better shape than they thought it might be. Go on. Some of the things that are associated now with the heavier rain that we have seen, especially in May, the development of diseases like bacterial blight. You can see up on the top of the 2 pictures there is bacterial blight. And then on the bottom, downy mildew. The humid conditions, even though it's been dry, it's been relatively humid. We just haven't had a lot of rain from it. And so that has caused some problems with any kind of fungal diseases. We're going to expect to see a lot more of that now, now that humidity is returning and rainfall is returning. The rain hits the ground and it splashes up spores onto the plants, and so they're more likely to get these diseases than they would if it was really dry conditions. Another problem is that because of the delays in the field work, some farmers had problems getting into the fields in a timely way to put in antifungal chemicals and things like that. And so they're behind on that, and it's showing up in some of the crops. And we also note that some of the hot and dry weather has hurt things like the young pecan trees. We have a lot of young trees because we lost so many in Hurricane Michael a couple of years ago. We go on. In the next week, we expect to see pretty good rainfall for most of the region, maybe with the exception of the Florida Peninsula. But a lot of this rain is expected to occur. I only picked the next week because the week after that, the models are starting to pick up on the possibility of maybe tropical development in the Gulf of Mexico or in that part of the Caribbean. And the rainfall maps really get skewed by whatever that particular model thinks is the direction that that storm is going in. So this is before any of that happens. Looks like pretty good rainfall for most of the weeks. I know that farmers are hoping for enough dry conditions in between so they can go in and put out their chemicals in dry conditions. The cloud cover from that rain is going to cool things down a little bit, but then I think it will probably warm up again after that. We go on. Some of the threats to agriculture in the coming weeks. The cooler conditions are going to slow crop growth a little bit. I don't think it's a major concern at this point, but if the lack of sunlight does hurt things like corn. Rainfall should improve, and the farmers are dancing in Georgia because we really need it. But you know, summer rain is usually hit or miss, so it doesn't take much difference between one field and the next to see a lot of difference in the amount of rainfall. Flash drought. The flash drought information from the CPC does show an increase in the likelihood of flash drought. I think now that the rain has returned, that will probably abate somewhat, but it's always a good idea if you're seeing impacts to report them. I was looking at the condition monitoring website this morning. It's pretty slow, but stick with it and try to get those reports in. And then if we do go into a more active tropical pattern, we're in the season now, that could cause flooding rain near the path. But at this point, of course, we don't really know where the storms will go, or even if they'll develop at all at this point. This is the time of year they're most likely to develop in the Gulf and the Caribbean, rather than be the classic storms coming off of Africa. So that's something that we'll be watching, but really it's just sort of a general threat, right? Nothing particular at this point. And if we go on, just a summary of the impacts here. The dry conditions have slowed the end of planting, but now farmers have been catching up on field work. Irrigation is occurring where it's available, and the dry crops are hurting, especially the pasture and forage. April frosts are generally providing less impact than expected, and we're expecting to see more disease pressure with the rain that's coming, and then just watching the tropics for the future. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to our special speaker on the Hurricane Outlook, Matthew Rosenkrantz.
Good morning, everybody. So yeah, Matthew Rosenkrantz, NOAA's new lead for the seasonal hurricane outlook. Jerry Bell retired after 30 years of federal service. On to the next slide. So just to remind everyone, generally what happens with the tropical season in the Atlantic, I know there's not so much East Pacific into this. The Atlantic, the official season is the 1st of June to 30 November. We do NOAA issues an outlook later in May, typically a Thursday, either the Thursday before Memorial Day or the Thursday before that, depending on the, just how the calendar lays that year. And then we will update the outlook in the first part of August, which is before the climatological peak of the hurricane season. So we have the latest information to go into those outlooks before kind of the season and before the peak of the season. If you do have interest further west, the Eastern Pacific season does peak a little bit sooner, July, August, September. Sometimes you do get recurving systems that can bring moisture all the way across Mexico. You can even get some that develop in, and we've seen a couple develop in kind of the Eastern Pacific, move across Central America and redevelop in the Gulf. So we've seen them go from the Gulf into the East Pacific. So there is some interplay between those as well. But that peaks a little bit sooner. That's July, August, September for their peak. Next slide. Just to go into climatologies and what we see kind of on an average year. The first named storm on average is July 9th. This is using all the years of data that we have. Hurricanes is August. First hurricane is August 10th, and the first Category 3 storm is normally September 4th. In the Atlantic, we can see the peak is about September 10th in the top right in the fire diagram. And that's the peak in hurricanes and tropical storms together. The peak of hurricane activity is also about the same time. There's in the record, there's activity all the way into May, and there's activity all the way into December, and there's actually some activity actually all the way into January, and even April. We've had storms technically. So there's the season really tries to encompass 90% of the activity. So the season isn't definitive. You can't get a storm outside of 1 June to 30 November, but it's just very unlikely. So, and this year we did update the normals. So when we look at the 1991 to 2020 average, it was 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. There was a reference earlier on to the climatology and where storms form. So in the upper left, the map is showing that storms in July typically form in the Gulf of Mexico or along the east coast of the US, or in the Caribbean, and then they move either inland from the Gulf of Mexico, or if they move from the Caribbean, they'll move up along the east coast typically. Once we get into August, you tend to get more of those deep tropical formations where they form into the Caribbean, around the Greater Antilles, and then move towards the west coast of the US. And that's where you can get the storms that have a lot of rainfall and destructive potential, because they have that longer time over water. September, about the same patterns as August, although there's just a more density, because there's more storms typically form in September. And then October, we do end up with a return of conditions where it's favorable for storms to form again in the Gulf of Mexico and off the east coast of the US. And that's because we'll typically get some cold fronts that come down, and sometimes you can get a tropical storm to spin up off of the kind of the end of a cold front. As it gets over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf Stream, you can get a storm. So those ones are typically short notice storms. They're out in the Gulf, they're warned on today, and they're moving inland by tomorrow or the next day. So you can get some short fuse situations then, especially in the shoulder seasons, July and then October, November. Next slide. This is a typical landfall climatology. This is updated through 2010. This map will be updated through the 2020 climatology coming up. So we can see most of the landfalls in the Gulf of Mexico, and then there's kind of not as many, not as frequent in the Big Bend of Florida, and then also into northern Florida and Georgia, and then you get a lot of landfalls in Florida and a lot of landfalls into North Carolina, especially the Outer Banks area, and then relatively lower as you go further north. Okay, next slide. So the outlook for this season, again, it was mentioned earlier, we're calling for 13 to 20 named storms, 6 to 10 hurricanes, and 3 to 5 major hurricanes. 110% to 190% of average or median for the entire accumulated cyclone energy. The above normal category starts at 130%. So our forecast range kind of goes from just slightly above, just kind of in normal range, to well above normal. So that's why we have a 60% chance of above normal and a 30% chance of near normal. We had about the same numbers as last year. So if we go to next slide, we can see that this year's outlook, that 60% chance of near normal, 30% chance, and 10% chance of below normal was about the same where we were at last year at this point. The outlook for this year is very similar to what we started with last year. There's some of the ocean conditions this year are not looking as conducive as last year. So that's why we didn't go as high as we went with our August outlook last year. We're not expecting as much activity this year as we had last year. We can see our August outlook last year, we went higher. We got up to 19 to 25 named storms, which was our highest ever forecast. And obviously we were exceeded. Mother Nature outdid us and got to 30 named storms last year. 14 hurricanes and 7 major hurricanes with 12 landfalls, and 191% of ACE. So next slide. Putting them in context, our NOAA 2020 outlook in the upper left, 110 to 190%. The kind of takeaway from this slide is that on those bar charts, that's what's called the accumulated cyclone energy. And that is, you can see the really active periods, which one is from 1995 until the current. You can see an inactive period, which is on that graph, kind of in the middle, 71 to 94. And then you can see an active period before that from 1950 to 1970. So the atmosphere and the ocean have these kind of periods where the ocean is warmer, the winds are lower, and you can get active and inactive periods. And right now we are currently in an active era, which kind of underpins the outlook, and generally kind of would favor an above normal, maybe on the high side of near normal, for until that period is over. So next slide. One of the key reasons we really look at that active era is the number of major hurricanes, and that's really what contributes to a lot of the cyclone energy. You get about double the number of major hurricanes in an active era than you get in an inactive era. So if I were to average those active era bars on the right, they'd end up in somewhere in the 3.5. But if I average them in the low activity era, it'd be like 1.5, 1.25 to 1.5. So you get about double the number. So that's kind of one of the things we look at. Next slide. Also the ratio of hurricanes to major hurricanes. So how many, once you get a hurricane, how many of them become hurricanes? The blue line on here shows the percent of hurricanes that become major hurricanes. And there's an increasing trend in this since 1970. I wanted to try and get where we had mostly coverage of satellite data for this, rather than trying to go all the way back to the 1950s, where we didn't have any satellites. But we do see that change in hurricanes at about 95, kind of more hurricanes, and then we do see a slightly increased percentage of them hitting major hurricanes. The active era will have a high activity era will have about 50% of every hurricane attains major hurricane status, which is winds of 111 miles per hour or greater. Typically, it's about 36% of the storms in an inactive era attain major hurricanes status. The next slide. Additionally, the big difference that we see in landfalls is along the Atlantic coast. We see a doubling of the rate of hurricane landfalls. Now, it was mentioned that only about 1 in 4 storms does impact the southeast U.S. And in any given year, during the low activity era, you only end up with a storm making landfall every other year. But during a high activity year, you can get a storm basically every year making landfall. On the Atlantic coast. On the Gulf Coast, there's not that much of a change, because most of the activity that defines these high activity and low activity eras is that activity that forms out over the Caribbean and the main development region of the Atlantic, with those long tracks that come towards us. Next slide. Next slide. This is going to talk about the El Nino. I know the outlook is coming out in a couple of days, so these figures are a little bit dated because I'm not allowed to talk about the upcoming outlook. But I pulled the latest slides that I could from this. We are looking at sea surface temperatures that are slightly below normal, but not cold enough to be La Niña. We are an ENSO neutral. There's no cold water underneath the surface. And also, so that's in the bottom right. And in the bottom left, that's our measure of cloudiness and rainfall over the tropics. There's really not a good El Nino signature there. We would expect a lot of oranges over the Central Pacific, right along the equator, and we kind of have a mixed signal there. There's some oranges, then they're broken along the equator, and then they seem to be very much related to things besides El Nino. So that's why that contributed to them stopping the La Nina advisory last month. Next slide. The latest outlook from 13 May does have a 50% chance of being an ENSO neutral, which would not do anything to suppress the high activity era. It really wouldn't enhance it either. So it'll kind of, that's why we're on our hurricane season outlook is for near normal to slightly above normal. So it's kind of the high activity era, but nothing to kind of amplify or enhance that, just kind of let that kind of come through. Next slide. Our model outlooks, this is the clustering in these model outlooks, having almost every single model from the 20 odd models that are on here, all in the near normal territory, with most of the model consensus and the kind of statistical corrections off these models, a lot of them being in the neutral to just slightly cold side, is telling that we're probably going to be an ENSO neutral for most of the season. I can tell you the latest updates on a lot of these models, they come out in the first couple of days of the month, are still very much in the neutral range for most of the hurricane season. Next slide. Next slide. Yep. So some of the things we did look at, again, the answer neutral. That can have, if you have a La Nina, that would really enhance Atlantic activity. El Nino really suppresses Atlantic hurricane activity. So we're an answer neutral, so we kind of don't have a switch from the Pacific to kind of modulate the Atlantic. The Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, on average, the sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic over the entire North Atlantic were slightly above normal earlier in the season. But there is a little stripe of cold that is right now in the Atlantic. We can see that the latest value. There it is. Kind of along the tropics there. But then that is actually starting to kind of ameliorate and go away a little bit in the last weekly data. And that's actually typical to get a kind of stripe of cool early in the season, as really you get a really strong high pressure over the, if you get a really strong high pressure over the Atlantic and you get really strong trade winds for a couple of months, you can get some cooler waters in the Atlantic. But the model forecasts all have that going away. The model forecasts are on the right-hand side in this graphic. They do show the temperatures becoming slightly warmer than normal throughout the Atlantic. And that prediction of the sea surface temperature in the Atlantic is one of the factors that goes into our outlook. The models for May still maintain temperatures going above normal through most of the Atlantic basin. Next slide. This was more so to talk about the Pacific, so I can skip this slide. One of the things we look at in the Atlantic that also has a factor is the strength of the West African monsoon, which is the bottom slide here. Green over Africa represents a upward, divergence in the upper levels and upward vertical motions, which means we have a lot of more chance for thunderstorms and rainfall over Western Africa, which means that the waves that come off of Africa, that are the seeds for most of the strongest hurricanes, are able to maintain themselves and maintain good strength across Western Africa before moving off into the Atlantic. So again, if you start with a stronger wave, you're more likely to get a hurricane, a stronger storm out of it. It's got more potential to develop into a tropical storm. So we monitor that, and that is showing an above normal West African monsoon. We also look at the trade winds and the flow kind of into Africa off of the Atlantic. So we can see in the main development region there in the green box, which is actually shifted slightly north in this map. There are some good strong trade winds in there from the northeast. That's where that stripe of cool waters are coming from. But that stripe has been getting slightly weaker as the days go on. It's also been moving further north, which we kind of expect to see as it goes further north as the season in the summer progresses. That kind of, there's a high pressure over the Atlantic. A lot of us notice the Bermuda high. It will shift slightly further north as the seasons go on, as we get into the summer season. We also will monitor the wind flow into the African monsoon, which is a kind of representing the trade winds over the Atlantic, and they are weaker than normal. We have these kind of this westerly component we see in these arrows in that blue oval coming from west to east. They're pointing at, so that's showing weakened trade winds or more flow into the West African monsoon, the low levels. It also has the kind of counterclockwise rotation to it, so that's a background of that is kind of circulation that is supportive of the waves coming off of Africa. So while we haven't seen much activity this year so far, we are looking at conditions that are conducive. Next slide. So that's the kind of the low level winds, African monsoon. We also look at wind shear. I know we've talked about wind shear in a lot of different topics. People that are in tune with the weathering community and atmosphere and climate community will hear about wind shear. And that's basically the difference in winds between the low levels, about 5,000 feet and about 40,000 feet. So we kind of measure that and try and predict that, because high shear will rip the storms apart. The models are forecasting below normal shear in general. That's the right-hand panel, and the blue is for below normal shear, which would help drive more storm activity. On the left-hand side, the CFS, which is the American climate model, It's got a little bit more of a mixed bag. It's got some low shear over the main development region out into the central Atlantic. Then as you get towards the Caribbean, it's got a little bit of high shear. So if that forecast were to come true, we'd probably see more than near normal activity, or you'd see some storms that kind of develop over the central Atlantic and then kind of get ripped apart as they go further west. Maybe not maintain so much strength. But that's only one of the models. The multi-model ensemble on the right is 4 different models, and that kind of shows a little bit weaker shear over most of the Atlantic. It shows more near normal towards the Caribbean a little bit again, but not as, it doesn't have any above normal shear at all. Next slide. So again, this is just a summary of the conditions we're expecting in the Atlantic. Above normal sea surface temperatures, weaker than average vertical wind shear. In general, weaker trade winds and a stronger West African monsoon. All of those are typically associated with high activity era conditions and the warm phase of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And then having ENSO neutral or possibly La Nina later in the season will allow these high activity era conditions to kind of shine through. And that's what gives us the forecast for near to above normal conditions. I think that's all I have. Oh, no, sorry, preparedness messages. I didn't know if everybody's in here. So one of the things you want to do now, being that we don't have activity out there, is you want to determine your risk. Start looking at where you live. If you live near a coast, storm surge is your #1 killer. If you're inland, heavy rains and high winds, you can get weak tornadoes with tropical storms. So that's something to think about. Develop an evacuation plan. And that kind of comes with completing a written plan. So reach out to your local emergency managers, and you have county level plans that are as well, and kind of integrate those with your life. If you have a child or a spouse that's off at a university somewhere and they're a little bit further away, or you have a business that's on the coast but you live inland, make sure to take into account all the parts of your life. Getting an insurance checkup as well. Make sure your insurance policies cover flooding. A lot of them don't. Also, think about how you'll get information. A lot of times right now we rely on the web. There's been a big web outage for a lot of websites today. So have a backup. A NOAA radio. NOAA weather radio is a very good way to get information. And just the general radio and TV stations. An old school TV antenna will work wonders for getting local television stations. Next slide. You also want to assemble some disaster supplies and try and strengthen your home right now. I know it's hard. There's a lot of supply constraints right now. So the earlier you can think about it and earlier start moving on those things, try to get those plans moving. If you need to do those kinds of things, if you really need to assemble a lot of supplies, food and water, ready.gov has great preparedness messages. And then once it comes on to hurricanes come, make sure to help your neighbors and help your community as much as you can, and they'll help you as much as they can help you. Next slide. So our takeaway, 13 to 20 named storms, 6 to 10 hurricanes, half of which could become major hurricanes. So start taking actions now, because if one of those major hurricanes comes your way, it can definitely change your life. There's some useful links in the bottom left on where to go for preparedness information. And then hurricanes.gov will have all the latest watches and warnings from the National Hurricane Center and even the Central Pacific Hurricane Center during the season. So that is all I have now.
Okay, thank you, Matt, for that presentation. That was really awesome. Meredith could not be here on this call today, but just a reminder that we do these webinars in partnership with NIDIS. So I will be looking over the questions. We do have a panel of climate experts on to help answer these questions. So let's see and just a few reminders too. A recap email will be sent out at the end here. All right, so looking at the questions, we do have one. I'll throw out to all the panelists so anybody can answer. Does the end of La Nina mean less chance of drought conditions developing in the Southeast United States?
That is a good question. So right now, we are in July, August, September. Rotation, we'll look at, actually it's May, so we'll look at June, July, August precip does have it could be a little bit dry into the interior, but there's not a real strong signal from my looking at our relationships between El Nino and June, July, August precip for CPC. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Hey, Sandra?
Yep.
Yeah, this is
Yep.
Victor Murphy. I'll chime in real quick. I think short term for the summertime or, into September, October, perhaps, really hard to make any firm conclusions out of the fact that La Nina is ending. On the one hand, as Matt pointed out, the lack of El Nino and also, well, the combination of the lack of El Nino and also La Nina ending will probably mean, as his forecast says, another active season for the Atlantic Basin. So statistically, you would think with the more active the season, the greater the chances of some sort of landfalling tropical system or tropical cyclone, in the southeast U.S. and rainfall goes along with it. I think a lot of the rainfall this time of year, or at least June through September timeframe, does come from tropical systems. So on the one hand, you would think it'd be conducive to more systems, therefore conducive to more rainfall. But like Jeff Dover also pointed out, and Pam, there's no way of knowing where the tracks will be. So I think sort of a mixed signals or a mixed bag, if you will, for the summertime. But going into the fall, and into the next cold season, I think the big takeaway message is, even though La Nina may be over with, the odds of El Nino coming back for the next cold season are very, very slim, very, very small. So that would point towards, or that would point the needle towards perhaps a dry or a below normal precipitation season for next fall and winter. That's way out in time.
All right, thank you, Victor.
This is Pam. Let me just add to that with the likelihood of tropical storms, the areas that get hit are going to have too much rain, but the areas that are away from the path are in the area of subsidence. And those are some of the areas that can get really dry. We saw that in some of the previous seasons where you had Matthew coming in the East Coast, but a lot of Georgia got missed by that and it was in the dry subsiding year, and the drought really got worse because of that. So it's really hit or miss with those tropical storms, just as Victor said.
Yeah, Pam, that's a great point. And I think it may have been that sort of quick drought or the flash drought, if you will, I think maybe September, October of 2019, in which I think there's a lot of systems that moved up the East Coast and stayed offshore, moving from south to north, offshore to the east of Georgia and the Carolinas. And actually, I believe, as you pointed out, Georgia's on the west side of the systems, and which was where they had the sinking air. And actually, it was well below normal. So really impossible to say what kind of impacts that the La Nina going away will have for the tropical season or for this southeast U.S., at least as far as rainfall or drought goes.
And Chip Conrad here. I just want to add too that in a typical summer in the southeast, we know we get a lot of thunderstorms. A lot of them are very hit and miss. And so when we think about the remainder of June and July and going into August, there's just going to be a lot of variability in precipitation. So there's probably going to be some areas, where drought could come back, and other areas that'll be wet. But I think at that time scale, it's really virtually impossible to predict those sort of things.
All right, thank you, Victor, Pam, and Chip. The next question, I believe, is for Matt. And it says, can you review or restate the relation between El Nino and hurricanes? Did you say a strong El Nino suppresses Atlantic hurricanes? And what about ENSO neutral and La Nina conditions?
Sure. ENSO neutral and La Nina, let me go back. La Nina can slightly enhance tropical cyclone activity or hurricane activity in the Atlantic. ENSO neutral does very little to moderate it, but a strong El Nino can dramatically suppress tropical cyclone activity in the Atlantic.
All
Does
right.
that-
Yeah. This next question is also for you, Matt. It's in a few parts again. And I guess for any panelist as well. Any additional thoughts on the model showing some type of tropical system next week? Do you see conditions supporting this possibility? And any thoughts on Atlantic sea temperatures and if they will be the same as last year or higher this
So I am looking at the 2-week outlook of tropical cyclone activity from the Climate Prediction Center right now. There is an enhanced possibility of tropical cyclone development or tropical storm development kind of in the western parts of the Caribbean near the Yucatan and then kind of Belize and southwest of Cuba. Highlighted June 9th to June 15th. They're going to update that outlook. The updated outlook for that comes out at about 2 p.m. today. It's every Monday and it comes out for a 2-week period. Every Tuesday, excuse me, it's released at about 2:30 in the afternoon for a 2-week period going forward in time. The sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic are not forecast to be as high as they were last year. They are not as high now as they were last year. They were about 3 times, I don't want to say 3 times, but they were much warmer in the Atlantic last year than they are this year. And the predictions for this year are not as high, as warm as what was observed last year.
All right, thank you again, Matt. Let's see, we do have another question here. Any thoughts of April, May incorporating ocean heat content as a supplement to SST and SST anomalies for seasonal forecasting? I believe this is for anyone.
Ocean heat content is the integral of the heat anomalies from a certain depth to the top of the ocean. We do take in subsurface information in the predictions for El Nino in multiple ways. One of the ways is the dynamical models for the ocean have multiple levels, and they go all the way down even to many thousands of feet below the surface of the ocean. So that's one way. So our coupled models do that. All the coupled models have that. Our statistical tools actually do take in some of the subsurface information, including both the amount or the intensity of the anomalies along the equator and even some of the off-equatorial sea surface temperature anomalies and even anomalies at depth. We typically use Central Tropical Pacific as an index. There's a literature paper about that and the warm water volume. Those are 2 of kind of predictors that we'll also use. So yes, subsurface information is taken into account, not directly as the heat content, because that's an integral over the top, but there's layers of subsurface information that are integrated.
All right, let's see. Any other questions out there? And we'll be sure to send any questions. If you have any questions that come to mind even after we end, please send them along and we will send these out to anybody to help get you those answers as well.
Yeah, I'm available for follow-up questions too if anybody has them. Just email them to me if it's appropriate for Matt.
All right, and I guess with that, I'd like to remind everybody to join us on July 13th, and we will have a special topic of new climate normals, and August 10th, the heat risk tools for the Southeast. And with that, I guess we will end today's webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to all of the presenters.
Thanks.